Good morning, everybody. I'm Jonathan Horton. I'm the student pastor here at Grace, and I am so glad that you've joined us for our online service this morning. There's two quick announcements that we want to let you know about right here at the front. And the first is that our plan is to be back at in-person services starting next Sunday. We will just have one service at 10 a.m. and we want to let you know that those of you who are ready to be at an in-person service, again, that will be an option. We will also continue to stream online for those of you who prefer to watch from home. The second announcement is for all of our kid ministry families and our student ministry families. I don't know about you, but if you're like our family, we are constantly looking for fun things to do as a family that allow for social distancing. So our church on August 1st is hosting a family photo scavenger hunt. It's going to be a photo scavenger hunt where you'll be able to take some pictures at home, some pictures throughout Odessa, but it won't require you to be in close contact with other people outside of your family. There'll be a competition side where we're going to be giving away prizes to the top 3 teams, as well as a grand prize gift basket that will be worth $175. It's going to be so much fun. If you are interested, you can register at graceodessa.com/photo hunt. Now let's get on to worship together.
Your even in barren, desperate seasons, no matter what the circumstance, you are the rock on which I stand. You are the God who always sees, even in barren, desperate seasons, no matter what the circumstance, you are the rock on which I stand. You are bigger than all my fears, God of love, God my love. You are bigger than all my dreams, God my hope, God my peace. Whatever will come my way, through each day I will say, God, I trust you, I trust you.
Good morning, Grace. Thanks so much for joining us in worship today.
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you, I worship you. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. 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 That is who you Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop. That is who you are. 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 Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are.
Hey, good morning, Grace. We are so glad that you could join us again live online I'm sorry that we kind of had to pause our in-person gatherings for a period of time, but hey, we were looking out for the best of everybody. I personally, my family, we thank you so much for all of the prayers and just the concerns, the way that you guys took care of us collectively over the last week or so as we've been sick. We're doing much better now, and hopefully I can get through this entire sermon without coughing. That would be great. But we're feeling wonderful. We're kind of back to our normal selves, and so we thank you for your prayers through this time. So we're going to continue our Acts series. We have 2 weeks left, today and next Sunday, and we will be done with Acts. It's kind of there's a part of me that's really excited about that, and a part of me that's kind of sad about that. I hope that you've enjoyed this series as much as I've enjoyed preaching through it. Acts is an incredible story. It's an incredible journey, and we've been on it together. What will be 25 weeks next week. We have been preaching through the same book of the Bible for 25 weeks. So, but we are reaching the end. But we can't reach the end until everything that God has spoken and promised to happen actually happens. And so over the last couple of weeks, we've been left with this reality that Paul, it's been a reality for the kingdom, but not yet for Paul, and Paul's been waiting for it, and that is to get to Rome. Paul wants to get to Rome, and so that hasn't happened yet. And so that's what we are, the readers are anticipating, right? We are anticipating this arrival to Rome, and it's coming, but not today. It's not coming today. Today is probably, in my opinion, it's the greatest, most known moment of Paul's life and his ministry. Not saying that it equates to him planting the churches. I just think it's the one thing that the majority of people, when they think about Paul, not from a church planting guy or building guy, but when you think of Paul in general, a lot of people jump to this story in Acts chapter 27, and it is the story of the shipwreck. And so, for me, when I think of Paul, for some reason, this is what I think about. I think of the shipwreck story. I think of it, and the reason I think of it is because Paul struggles through his life multiple times. But the shipwreck will be a story that he himself will bring up multiple times. And so it was, not only is it important to us as readers today, but it was also an important event for him. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why this event was so important. It's because this is a moment in Paul's ministry life in which God reminds him, hey, I'm in control. And not only am I in control now, but I've always been in control. It's crazy to me. It's just crazy to me that Paul, of all people, still needed to be reminded that God is in control. Paul has been in situation after situation, trial after trial, in which his life was threatened, in which he had been in prison. Paul had been in all these scenarios, and never once have we ever seen Paul question God's sovereignty in any of it. Paul doesn't seem to be the kind of guy that needs to be reminded that God is in control. Yet here we are, Acts 27, almost to the end of the story, and Luke is still writing about these moments in Paul's life in which God shows up and says, hey, I got this. Paul still needs reminders that God is in control. So I think it's an important theme for us. We live right now in what seems to be complete lack and loss of control. We live in a scenario that none of us ever thought about. We never imagined that this would be our reality. We never thought that we would have to be locked in our homes for seasons of time. We never thought that we would have to wear face masks or social distance or be limited to the number of people in stores. None of that ever was a thought. That was never going to be our reality. Yet here we are. We live now in a context that feels completely out of our control. Acts 27 is that same theme. it's a storm, and everything feels out of control. But before we get to Acts 27, if you're really good and you're a note taker or you follow well, you know that I skipped Acts chapter 26. I'm skipping it kind of on purpose. Acts 26 is Paul's trial with King Agrippa. Now, King Agrippa is the king over the Caesarea Philippi region under Roman rule. So, yes, his title is King Agrippa, but he's actually not the man. The man is Caesar himself. And that's who Paul wants to get to, is Caesar. Now, it's interesting, if you go back and read Acts 26, Paul's desire to get to Caesar is actually what lands him on this boat in Acts 27 in the first place. Because at the end of Acts 26, Paul goes to trial before King Agrippa. He goes to trial before the lawyers of, basically the Roman council. And he goes into this trial. And Paul basically comes out of that trial with all the Roman authority agreeing that he has done nothing wrong and he does not deserve to be imprisoned and definitely does not deserve to die. They want to see Paul be released. That's what that's the conclusion they all came to. They want to see Paul released. But the problem is that Paul had already petitioned the courts to take his trial all the way to Caesar himself. I want you to know that. I want you to know that the reason Paul is going to be on a boat that is ultimately going to shipwreck is not because he should be imprisoned. It's not because he's done anything wrong. It's not because he is like a terrible, no good person. It's because Paul made a petition to take his trial to Caesar. Now, the only thing that I can think, the only thing that makes sense in my head, the only way that this works out for me is I have to say, man, Paul must have known something. Paul must have known something. And here's what I think it was. The Spirit of God had told Paul, you, Paul, will be the one to take this message all the way to Rome, the seat of Caesar. You, Paul, will be the one who brings the gospel message all the way to Rome. I think Paul saw this as his opportunity to get himself to Rome. Hey, if I tell them I want to petition the courts, I want to go all the way to Rome and see Caesar, they will get me there, because that's the amount of hatred that Paul had stirred up in the Jewish people around these Roman cities. He knew he could get to Rome, and he was going to get to Rome not on his own dime, but on the Romans' dime. So Paul's playing this out pretty well. It seems, at least to me, that Paul kind of knows what he's doing, what he's actively establishing. It starts out, but in my own understanding, it starts out as Paul's way of accomplishing God's plan. That's the way that I read the rest of this story. This was Paul's way of doing and accomplishing that which God had called him to. And there's really an element for us in every kind of course of life that we feel God calling us to. There's the opportunity that we have to say yes to that calling. We then have to begin to do things, actions and words and conversations and plans. We have to begin all of that stuff so that we could be sure that the calling that is placed in our lives is not just, a feeling, but it's really what God desires for us. And so that's what Paul has done. Paul has said, God has told me to go to Rome. And he has created this plan. He's had strategic conversations to get him to the place that he feels God leading him to. So that's kind of what's happened in Acts chapter 26. So let's pick up the story in Acts chapter 27. The boat that Paul was originally put on was a small coastline boat. It wasn't intended to get him all the way to Rome. It was just intended to get the journey started. So they've actually ported and they have found a ship from Alexandria that is going to Rome. It's a big ship, and so they have just gotten on this boat and they have just left, or they're about to leave harbor, and that's where we'll pick up the story in Acts 27, verse 7. We had several days of slow sailing, and after great difficulty we finally neared Nebus. But the wind was against us. So we sailed across Crete and along the sheltered coast of the island, past the Cape of Salmone. We struggled along the coast with great difficulty and finally arrived at Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. We had lost a lot of time, The weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officers about it. "Men," he said, "I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on. Shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger are to our lives as well." But the officer in charge and the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and owner than to Paul. And since Fairhaven was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. All right, so Paul was on this ship, and he's kind of like he's preparing himself to go to Rome, but it doesn't start well. The weather is against them. This is becoming late in the fall, probably somewhere between late September and the end of November, somewhere in there. It's late in the fall, and the weather is beginning to turn. This may be, by some statistics kind of ship records, this possibly could have been one of the very last ships on its way to Rome at the time, because eventually they just shut down the Mediterranean Sea. It got so dangerous to sail in during the winter time. But Paul's on this boat, and the weather is against him, and it's not favoring well the crew either. So even in favorable sailing circumstances, the trip that Paul has embarked on would take 4 to 5 weeks' time. That would be if all things went right. But this story and this journey, by the time he actually arrives to Rome, it's going to be over 4.5 months worth of travel. This is not going to be a journey that is going to be one of luxury whatsoever, right? So Paul is eager to get to Rome. We know that to be a truth. He's talked about it multiple times. He's ready to get to Rome. He's petitioned the courts to send him to Rome. But there's something about this particular spot, this stop, that allows Paul a moment to say, you know what, guys? Maybe we should just rest here for a minute. He seems for some reason to want to slow the process. And I think that this is a moment where Paul is trying to control the situation. He's trying to say, well, let's take a minute and slow down. Let's control this, because if we go slower, then we can control things a little bit better. But God will bring situations up. Situations in life that we must be willing to give up control. And I don't know, I can't prove it, but I think that there's an element of that right here now. While it makes sense to stay in Fairhaven, for Paul, that's not going to be an option. The voices and the people around him that he's trying to sway, they're not in agreement. And I think that there's an element of God at work. God wants to make sure that Paul remembers that he is in control, that he is sovereign, that he has everything under control, and he needs to trust him. And so nobody agrees with Paul, and Paul has to continue the journey even in unfavorable circumstances. Let's keep reading. Verse 13. When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought that they could make it. So they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly, and a wind of typhoon strength, called a northeastern, burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Cauda, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat being towed behind us. Then the sailors bound ropes around the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars of Syrtis, off the African coast. So they lowered the sea anchors to slow the ship and were driven before the wind. The next day, as gale-force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began throwing the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars, until at last, all hope was gone. So at the beginning of this section of scripture, the weather seems to have a moment of favorability. Light winds from the south. This is the sailor's sign. Now is the time to go. So they pull up anchor and out to sea they go. But it doesn't last long. But in that moment of good weather, you could kind of, I don't know, in my own mind's eye, I kind of see these other sailors mocking Paul. Oh man, like, here's the guy who thought that everything was going to go south, that nothing was going to go right, that shipwreck was before us. And look at this. Favorable winds, clear skies, the weather is perfect for sailing. This is why we didn't listen, Paul. You don't know what you're talking about. But oh, how it changes, right? The winds begin to blow and it changes abruptly. The good weather does not last long. I don't know about you, but I feel like this is life sometimes, right? Things finally start to look like they're going right. Maybe there was a season of stress and uncertainty, but man, you've found this place and it's just this unexpected, noticeable peace. Everything seems good and right, and you're like, maybe this is the way it's supposed to be. And so you keep going, you keep trekking, you keep doing the things that you think you're supposed to do, but then the storm rages again. And it's not because you've done anything wrong. These sailors didn't do anything wrong. They noticed the favorable winds and they said, hey, it's time for us to go. This is what sailing is like. We could see the sun and the stars and the winds are right. Let's go and let's get out to sea. It wasn't because they made bad choices. It's just that's the reality of storms. They just come. It's not always your own doing. Sometimes it's just the world around you. The brokenness of the world that we live in. It brings storms. God has a unique way of working through them. And he has a phrase he likes to use a lot, and we're going to get there here in a minute. But I want you to see the crew's response. See, the crew's response to the unfavorable circumstances, the winds blowing against the ship, is to, again, try to take control. They began to steer the ship into the wind, and they're unable to. The wind is too strong. They can't control the wind, so they just have to give up and allow the wind to control the boat. They began to throw cargo overboard to lighten the ship. This would raise the ship up out of the water, allowing it to be easier to control. Everything that these men are doing is trying to gain control, but it is all for nothing because in the end, they lose sight of the sun and they lose sight of the stars. And whenever they no longer have the sun or the stars, they can no longer find their own direction. And whenever they cannot find their own direction, their response is one that I think you will be familiar with. Whenever we can't find direction, we tend to lose hope. This is a hopeless situation. Nothing seems to be going right. Nothing is going the way that they wanted it to go. This is the moment that Paul had said would happen, and it's happening. And here's what Paul has to say. Verse 21. No one had eaten for a long time. So finally, Paul called the crew together and said this. Here's his moment, right? Men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. You would have avoided all this damage and loss. But take courage. None of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. For last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me. And he said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island. Paul gets this moment, right? It's that I told you so moment. And I think that it probably felt kind of good. It probably felt good for Paul to have a moment to say, see guys, I told you. See, the reality of Paul is he's been a missionary for 25 years. The dude's done a lot of traveling. He's been on boats multiple times. He's been on boats in storms multiple times. Paul's not just a nobody, he is a somebody, and he can speak with some authority, but people weren't listening to it because Paul at the time is a prisoner. Now he's different than the other prisoners. An interesting fact is that most of the prisoners on the boat with him were probably on their way to Rome to be fighters in the Colosseum, to lose their lives for the entertainment of the Roman people, for Caesar's grand show. But not Paul. Because remember, Paul wasn't even supposed to technically be on the boat. He wasn't truly a prisoner. He was only a prisoner because he wanted to be. That's why Paul is where he is. And no, his voice didn't matter. Nobody's going to listen to a prisoner. Nobody's going to listen to a guy who's on the boat to go and stand trial before Caesar over in Rome. No, he's just a dude that they need. He's cargo that they need to get to Rome. But Paul's words could have been life-saving had they stayed in Fair Haven, sorry. But they don't. They want to get to Phoenix. And so Paul goes along with them. And in the middle of the storm, something happens. He stands up and he gets their attention. Now this is something Paul's good at. He stands up and he speaks to the men and he tells them, "Take courage. None of you will lose your lives, though the ship will go down." Take courage. It's a bold claim. It's a bold claim to say take courage while you're in the middle of a storm that you have zero control over. And all of your attempts to gain control have just been destroyed by the winds that are against you. You can't see the sun, you can't see the stars, so you have no direction. You have lost hope. It takes a lot of courage for someone to stand up and say, take courage. Because nothing around Paul is looking like it's going to go right. There is nothing happening in the physical, in the tangible, that looks like this is going to end well. But there is something happening that is bigger than both the physical and the tangible. The Spirit is at work. And the Spirit has shown up and has told Paul, you're not going to die, and neither is anybody else on this boat. Take courage. These words have become a theme in Scripture, specifically in times of storm. Jesus in Mark 6 says these words to the disciples as they find themselves on a boat in a storm. Let's look at it. Mark 6, verse 47 and following. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on the land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the winds and the waves. So they're in the middle of a storm, and they're working against the storm to try to control their own boat. They're struggling to maintain control, and that's when Jesus sees them. Jesus sees them. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. They cried out. He intended to go past them. But when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking that he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said to them. And here it is. "Take courage, for I am here." Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped, and they were totally amazed. Take courage. Paul says it to the men as they're on the ship in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Jesus says it to the disciples as they're on as a small boat in the middle of the lake, fighting against the winds and the rain. What I want you to see in the Mark story, though, is that Jesus intended to walk past them. Now, that's an interesting statement for us to pull out. Jesus his original intention was not to get in the boat with them. His intention was to walk past them. But they saw him, and they were terrified, so terrified that they began to cry out, they begin to freak. Not only have they lost control of the boat to the storm, but now they see a ghost walking on the water. And Jesus looks at them and sees them in their uncertainty. He sees them in their fear. He sees them in their loss of control. And he speaks to them and says, "Do not be afraid. I'm here." Now, I don't think that Jesus would have let anything happen to the disciples. But I do think that his intentions were to allow them to remain in the middle of the storm out of control. Always watching, always being close, never abandoning them. I'm confident that if Jesus' plan would have played out and he would have been able to walk past them, he could have drawn the boat to him. He could have stood on the opposite side of the lake and drawn the boat to him, and all would have been fine. But because Jesus loves first, he sees them in their fear and he doesn't want to leave them there. So he gets in the boat with them. Paul is in the middle of a storm. The intention is to get to Rome, to stand trial before Caesar, to bring the gospel message to the masses. But in the middle of this storm, there is fear. In the middle of this storm, there is uncertainty. In the middle of this storm, there is a loss of control and direction. And so Jesus sees Paul and in his spirit speaks to him. "Paul, do not fear. You're not going to die. You are going to stand trial before Caesar. And you know what? None of the men with you will die either. Don't fear. Take courage." The storm doesn't change. The environment of the storm didn't change. Notice back in Mark, Jesus doesn't pause the storm and then tell the disciples to take courage. Jesus tells them to take courage, to not be afraid while the storm is still raging. Then he speaks peace. Maybe this morning you're in the middle of something that you have given up. It is so out of control. Nothing around you looks the way that you wanted it to go. There is no direction that you have any longer. You're not really sure what you're supposed to do, who you're supposed to be, or who you're supposed to be with. You have no direction and no clue what is going on. And you're looking around and you're thinking to yourself, God can't be here. It's too crazy. It's too chaotic. Well, listen to Paul's words. Take courage. Take courage. Because God has not abandoned you. Isaiah 43 reminds us that God is the God of promise. That God is the God who sees all things through. That he has never given up on his people. Isaiah 43 says this, "Do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid because I am with you. God stands with you. He may not be physically present. You may not see him physically, but if you pay attention, you will recognize his spirit at work. Nothing is out of control. You see, God gave Paul this promise. You're going to Rome. So Paul got on that boat way back in Caesarea. Paul got on that boat in full confidence he was going to get to Rome. Now everybody else, who knows? But Paul knew he had to get to Rome because that's what God had told him. That's what God had told him. So Paul knew he would be okay. There was a confidence that Paul had in this journey. Paul had to get to Rome. But God tells Paul, not only are you getting there, but nobody on this ship is going to perish. God keeps his word. God keeps his word over his people. And if he called you to something, you will see it. You will. Now, maybe not in the time frame you thought, maybe not in the ways that you thought, maybe not by the avenues that you thought, but if God has called you to something, you will arrive to it. Now, here's what I love about the story. While Paul was the one who was called to Rome, when God shows up to remind him to take courage, when God shows up to remind him that his presence is with him on this boat, God makes sure that Paul understands that it's not just the presence of God for him, but it's the presence of God for everybody. While God might be calling Paul to Rome, he's not going to abandon everybody else in the process. He's not going to say, because I'm with Paul, I can't too be with you. That's not the way that God works. God provides, God shows up, God sustains all people in the middle of the storms. Fight fear, not by ignoring the storm around you, but by remembering the God of the promise. That's what we need to be doing right now. In the middle of all of this crazy, in the middle of this pandemic, in the middle of this sickness, which is no fun, by the way, speaking from experience, it's no fun. But in the middle of all of it, we can rest in this truth while everything else seems out of control, while everything else is spiraling in chaos, while everything else is just strange and weird and unknown. Here's one thing that I can lean into. God is sovereign over all of it. God is in control. So fight fear, not by ignoring the storm around you, but by remembering the God of the promise. Let's keep going. Acts 27. The ship hasn't wrecked yet, so there's more to the story, right? About midnight on the 14th night of the storm. 14 nights. 14 nights of storm. This isn't just a quick, one and done. No, this is a monster. This is a trial. This is no fun. All hope has been lost. And Paul stands up and says, take courage. God is with us. But then there's still 14 nights of storm. These men are wondering, are you sure? Are you sure that your God is with us? 14 nights. 14 nights. As we were being driven across the sea, the sailors sensed land was near. They dropped away to line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. But a little later, they measured again and found it was only 90 feet deep. At this rate, they were afraid we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboats as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes of the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. "You have been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks," he said. "Please eat something now for your own good, for not a hair on your heads will perish." Then he took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began to eat, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. When morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut the anchors and left them at sea. Then they lowered the rudders, raised the foresail, and headed toward shore. But they hit a shawl and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship struck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land. The others held on to planks or debris from the broken ship. So everyone escaped safely to shore. That's a good shipwreck story. It's harsh, it's hard, and it's abundant. It's big, and it has a force behind it. It's something that I want you to feel as we talk through the rest of this. This wasn't just a, oh no, we hit a rock. This wasn't just a, oh, we got to repair this. No, this was a moment in which everything that man's security, the ship, the ropes, the lifeboats, all of it was destroyed. There was nothing else to put hope in. There was nothing else to put faith in. The only thing that remained was God. Some of the sailors try to leave the boat. It's interesting that Luke records this. It's this moment in which the men on the boat are going, no, we got to get out of here. We're the ones who need to be saved. These other guys are just prisoners and soldiers, but we're the sailors. We're going to leave. We're going to go save ourselves. And Paul sees them trying to escape, and he looks to the commander and says, if they leave, we're all going to die. And the commander cuts the ropes of the lifeboat so that they can't go anywhere. It's this moment of like, hey, we're all in this together. If this ship goes down, we're all going down with it. That's the way that I feel like life works best. It's all or nothing for everybody, right? That's the way that it is. That's the way that the kingdom of God works. It's all or nothing for everybody. Not a few of us can't just go, you know what? This isn't working out. This is going down. I got to get out while I can. No, because in doing so, you leave others to suffer and to struggle. But that's not what God's about. God's about saving everybody on the boat. Saving all of them. And God has a plan. It's to run this ship aground. That's the plan. At least that's what it's looking like. And so Paul, he ruins this. He ruins the plan. Some of the sailors try to leave. Paul says they're trying to get off. If they get off, we die. And then immediately after that moment, Paul gathers everybody around the dinner table. Don't miss this, y'all. Paul's just ruined the plan of the sailors trying to escape and save their own lives. And he knows it. And his go-to is food. That's what he goes to. He gathers everybody around and he says, we need to eat. Can I just tell you that it's important for all of us to have a party planner in our lives? It is. It's important. And you need a good party planner. You need somebody in your life who, even in the middle of storms, is decorating a table. That's the kind of people you need. That's the kind of people you need. Otherwise you will miss something. You see, they're not being insensitive. It's not that they don't care that there's a storm. It's not that they don't care that you've suffered a loss in your family. It's not that they don't care that you're struggling with an addiction, or that they don't care that you're struggling with a health concern. None of that. It's not that they don't care about that. They do. They care deeply about it. But their response is to not keep drawing attention to the storm. Their response is to draw attention to the promises of God. God is a great provider. Jehovah Jireh. It's one of his names. In the middle of storms, we need people in our lives who can remind us of Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. And that's what Paul does. Paul gathers the people around the table and he says, we need to eat. And it says that he prays and breaks bread. Paul, in the middle of a storm, has time to share communion. That's what Paul does. As the waves are breaking the boat, Paul says a prayer and breaks bread with his fellow men. Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. So they cut the anchors. They decide, you know what, let's just run this thing aground. They cut the anchors because sometimes you have to let go of all the weight that you've been carrying, holding yourself back, trying to maintain control, all the things that you've done, all the wrongs, all the rights, everything that you carry with you and drag behind you. At some point you have to say, I can't control it anyway, so you got to cut the weight and allow God to be God. So they cut the anchors and they let God have control of the situation. They just drop the sail and say, wind, take us where you want. They drop the sail and they begin to run this thing into the ground. Listen to me. Pay attention. If you don't hear anything else, hear this. Sometimes the will of God, sometimes the sovereignty of God looks like a shipwreck. It looks like it's broken. It looks like it's disgruntled. It looks like it is beaten. It looks like it is destroyed. But you know what? Is in the end, all 276 men find their way to shore alive. God is getting Paul to Rome. But right now, it sure doesn't look like it. Right now, it looks like everything has gone wrong. It looks crazy. It looks scary. It's definitely undesired. It is insane. But God was in it. And God was in control. I could picture God at the end of this, of all these men looking at Paul and going, this is what your God had in mind. This is what you and your God schemed up. And Paul looking back at all of them. And if you're on Facebook or Instagram, we've seen these memes of the crazy driver and your hair's all crazy, messed up because you've been pulling at it because life has been insane and nothing is in control. And God and Paul look at this group of men and say, yeah, but did you die? I brought you here. I got you. I've always had you. It might not look the way that you would have planned it, but I don't want it to always look the way that you would have planned it. I want the control. God is a jealous God. And God likes the control because God is the one who wants the glory. See, if Paul stayed in harbor, then Paul would have gotten the glory of saving the men, of saving the boat, of saving the ship. Whenever Paul arrived to Rome eventually, Paul would have got the glory of a safe arrival to Rome. But God doesn't want Paul to have the glory. God wants the glory. God wants the story. And sometimes for God to get the story, you got to go through the storm. That's the way that it works. And it's not by God's design. It's by our flaws. Because we are so good. We are so good at making our own plans. We are so good at navigating this life when things are good and things are right that it's really easy for us to get down the road a little ways and look back and say, check out what I did. And boast ourselves up and puff up our pride and speak out to the world that they just need to follow us because we've come this far, so imagine how much farther we can go. But the reality of it is we came this far because the winds were favorable. We came that far because the sun was out. We came that far because everything was working the way that it was supposed to work. But what happens when a storm comes? Because storms always come. What kind of person are you? Are you the kind of person who just begins to throw everything off the boat? Are you the kind of person who throws all the anchors to the back to try to slow everything down so that you can maintain control? Are you the kind of person who will do everything that you can to maintain control of a situation that long ago you lost control of? The question that really speaks to me out of Acts 27 is, where's the hope? You see, whenever the sun and the stars can no longer be seen, that's when the sailors lost hope. This morning, ask yourself, where does your hope rest? Does it rest in your bank account or your job? Does it rest in your health? Does it rest in your physical appearances? Does it rest in your knowledge and understanding? Does it rest in your family? Does it rest in your skills? Where does your hope rest? Because if it rests in any of that stuff, as long as the winds are favorable, you'll be successful. You'll succeed. But the moment a storm comes, all of a sudden, that stuff no longer holds up. And your knowledge of sailing, your knowledge of the skies, your friends and your family, the resources, it all becomes useless. And you might start to abandon it. Because that's where your hope was. Before a storm comes, or another storm comes, can I challenge you to truly rest in the certainty of God? Because He is sovereign, and He's over all of it. Take courage, for He is here, and He will provide in the middle of the storms. And while it might not look the way that you wanted it to or thought that it would, God may bring you through something. And you can look at Him with your hair crazed out, your clothes torn up, your nails chewed off, and you can say, "What were you doing?" And His response might be, "But did you die? I brought you through." You see, the one thing that we didn't get to is what we will see next week. That Paul will arrive on an island, and he will be greeted by people who he will have the opportunity to speak life into. He'll be greeted by a warm fire and food. And ultimately, Paul will arrive in Rome. Not the way he might have thought it was going to happen, but always the way that God designed it to happen. This week, my life was out of control. A lot of you, your lives have been out of control. But since you logged on this morning, I hope that we can all agree that while we may look like we're out of control, the world around us may look insane and nothing like we intended it to look, we will rest in this truth, that if God is for us, nothing can stand against us. And so, that's where I will put my hope. I hope you will do the same. Have an incredible week, church. We'll see you next Sunday in person at 10 o'clock at Grace. I can't wait. See you then. God bless. Bye.
We're so glad that you've joined us online this morning. Just a quick reminder that we will be back in-person services starting next Sunday. For those of you who are ready to be at in-person services, again, we look forward to seeing you at 10 a.m. If you would like to partner with us financially and give towards our ministry, you can do so at graceodessa.com/give. And final reminder, we want to remind you that if you are interested in participating in the family photo scavenger hunt, go register online at graceodessa.com/photo hunt. We hope that you have a great week. We'll see you next week.